Hello there, this is Gary Garretts. Hope you had a chance to see part one of this two-part demo about composition, landscape drawing, and mixed media. In the second part, the focus is on using design, organizing values, shapes, and combining ink and colored pencil together to make unique textures. So I'm just adding this little reference photo of a barn out in the middle of a national park up in Utah. I've done several drawings of this scene as well as some plein air paintings, so look for it as it comes up later on in the demo. So first off, I'm laying in some big long marks on this page just to sort of get an idea of the foreground, the middle ground, and the cliffs in the background. Dividing up the space, kind of looking over the entire composition and see where things are going to be placed, but not really worrying about any details at this point. You might notice that I'm not using an eraser at this point. I'm looking at where the forms are overlapping the other forms. Trying to keep a good design to it. I can see I've already made mistakes on the roof. I'll change that later, but definitely going to play up the idea of the architecturalness and also the organic natural areas like the cliffs and the hills and the foreground elements. As you might notice, I don't freak out as I make mistakes on this because all that's going to be buried in the process of drawing later when I put the markers over the top of it and the other textures. I just don't spend a lot of time doing that. It's not that I don't try to be as precise as possible, it's just that I don't have a heart attack if things go wrong. It'll obviously be changed later. The composition's depth relies more on large overlapping planes and size differences rather than linear perspective. Perhaps you'll notice that those lines going from left to right keep the continuity of the landscape and the background elements together so you don't lose control of where everything is. Remember, you can always go back and pause the video and take a look at it so you might be able to look through that a little bit more clearly. As I block this in, you'll see a diagram come up with the first idea of shape welding. And that's the idea of taking all those shadowed areas and combining them together to make sort of a big monstrous shape to be able to compare against the other shapes that I can keep everything under control and keep my design flowing. Then I can bring in the other diagram and show you how the lines going from side to side and overlapping also affect the depth of space. Now that I have the larger forms like the sky, ground, architecture units like the barn and the corral put in, now I can start to break them up into more interesting secondary sort of shapes, going into the cliffs in the back, more shadow shapes, and making sure that I don't get any tangents, that I'm coming in and making the design very clear. So when I go in and block out, let's say, the painting part of it, the marker part, I'll have a really clear guide on my lights and my darks. Now the idea of using your shadow shapes is really important because if you are doing this outside plein air urban sketching, the light's obviously going to be changing all the time. And if you have this guide to go back to when you sort of paint in and block in the bigger forms, you always have an organizing principle that you can follow back on. So I've turned my attention to the trees and the house in the background, and though it may not be implicit with that big green line going across from edge to edge, I'm definitely keeping that in mind to make sure that I keep my sizes right and I keep those trees in the back as being secondary actors to that barn, but still keeping them in line so there is a continuity and an organization to it. Now my focus is the foreground area, using the corral to sort of bring your eye more into the foreground. And that's also going to mean a little bit more texture on that wood in the future. But I'm using those diagonals to, again, push your eye up more towards the front part of the format, basically the bottom part of the composition. Starting to get into more of those juicy little details more than I usually do for this demo. But as I put them in, I make sure that I leave those simple, readable graphic shapes in it. The bigger ones that are off on the diagram to the side to help me organize things that no matter how much information I get in there, I won't lose it when I come back to the real scene again. Usually when I lay out a drawing, I don't put in this amount of detail, but this will keep you sort of settled in to see when I start painting it at this next step of the process. I'm about to really jump on the values here, but this will give you a good diagram or blueprint of what I'm about to do. This is a 20% French warm gray Faber-Castell marker that I'm using to blast this in, and I like this because it's water-based rather than chemical-based, so it doesn't run a lot. It's got more of a real brushy fluid quality to it. And you might notice that I'm not being too special with it, doing a lot of overlaps, random strokes in the wood. I know I'm going to be coming over the top and laying texture in later, sort of coloring it in and knocking in all of those, like I said before, those value shapes, and combining all of these different textures together. Again, just to get the idea of the rhythm and the harmony of the lights and the darks first before I start putting a lot of detail into it. You might notice that I'm not trying to go for a uniform kind of level to it. Some areas I'm sort of building up the marks a little bit more, perhaps where there's a little bit more shadow, perhaps even where the dirt's maybe kicked up a little bit more. That way it keeps the edge and the interior very lively and not mechanical. I am sort of being a little bit more careful in getting the, let's call it more natural areas where there might be a little bit more variance in the weight of the line, as opposed to the architecturalness of the barn, where I make sure that the edges stay really crisp and angular. Perhaps now you can see that diagram up in the corner and that shape welding that I'm talking about. Even though it's not flat, it does have some of the same characteristics that keep everything organized. To counterbalance that warm tone, I'm going to come in with a water pen, a Pentel water pen with a solution of blue-black ink really diluted out to paint in, let's just say, the more shadowed areas or a different area of a different texture, and even overlay it over the top of the warm areas sometimes, just to give it, again, a different look to it. You'll see as I go along that frequently I'll overlap maybe 4 or 5 different kinds of materials in one area just to give it a different texture and a different look of the light, the way that it's hitting it. Right now I'm going up into the clouds and just making sure that I get the shaded sides on the underneath and get a different kind of density to it. And using the same materials and the same blue all over the place, again, this sort of unifies the entire composition together. Sometime on some very large areas with just a little bit of blue, and then sometimes I really go in and knock it in thick. I'm going to go shut up here for a few seconds and just paint. Now I want to make those corral railings pop a little bit more, so I picked up a pin with a 3/4 blue-black solution to it, and I'm laying in those railings, again, just to give them weight and to make them more compositionally more, to bring your eye to the foreground. I'll be putting other mixtures of colored pencil and pin over the top of that to even bring them out even more, but right now it gives a really good dimension to them. I brought in that diagram on the upper right to show you that now you can start to break it apart a little bit more, so there's more warm and cool areas, but still I work with that initial shape that I put down and into the sky and even into the background to make sure that once again you have a continuity and an organization to your composition as you start to lay in cool and warm colors over one on top of the other. At this point, start to bring a little bit more detail in it. The first part is probably the easiest part to do it, since it's in the background, will be the cliffs. It's also a little bit more on the abstract side. You're bringing this sort of like a little bit more of a cool purplish marker in here, and see the marks I'm putting in? They're not random, they are planned, and they're going in a rhythmic pattern. They're just filling it in using that warm undercolor of the sandstone to lay in a base for the shadows over the top of it. Now it may look like it on the video, but this is not a black tone that I'm putting down. It's a very dark gray, but it's showing in a sense the weight of the wood and the weight of the shadow that's going over the top of it. Remember, you still got that shadow shape that overrides everything, that's giving the context of the railings that you're putting in and the darkness that's there, along with the window in the back. But I'm still leaving like little holes and jumping in little teeny tiny shapes on the inside of it, so I just don't color it in like a coloring book and it doesn't look in too flat. Here's a little tip in using markers. As you use them, they'll have a tendency to dry out on the side that you're using. So what I'll do is, as I draw, I'll flick them up and then turn the barrel so I get new wet material on the opposite side of the tip. You might notice that I'm taking the same warm gray marker and using it for the clouds, again to give it a little bit more of a warm bounce of that desert sandstone up into the underneath sides of the cloud, and then moving right into the side of the barn to get the texture of the wood, or at least the start of the texture of the wood. I'm not copying it, I'm just again looking for the pattern and the rhythm that'll be able to cover over the top of it with some colored pencil. Once again, I'm going to pull in that shadow shape diagram so you can see that even when putting the texture in, I don't defeat the shadow shapes and the bigger organizing forms that I've laid in before. At this stage of the composition, I'm going to bring in some colored pencils and some Pentel brush pen markers to start working on the textures. Laying in the ground plane, kind of the edges of the building. I try not to outline, though it does look like sometimes that I'm kind of laying in a little bit more of the boundaries between one form and the other. This is knowing what the media does, laying one thing over the top of the other and perhaps experimenting with it first before you go out into the field and doing it. This is a brush pen. This gives if I use it fast, it gives a really nice kind of dry brush approach to the roof. It also makes for some really nice dry brush textures on the side of the wood. The colored pencil, as I go over the top of it, especially using the side, will give me a little bit more of a wood grain feeling to it. Now it's hard when you're drawing doors and windows to make sure that they don't sort of break out away from the entire drawing. So that's why I'm using the side of the pencil rather than the tip. That again, you get the texture of the paper in there, and it helps your design and helps unify the textures along with that initial shape design that you put in. Make sure when you put the textures in, it doesn't overwhelm the object that you're drawing unless that's part of the design somehow. It's important that people make sure that they see the object first that you're drawing, and the secondary textures kind of add to your narrative. Don't subtract from it. You might notice that I use a combination of thin line built up, some singular thin line, and then the side of the pencil to kind of use a broader grain on the wood. Makes it a little bit more dynamic and the rhythm a little bit more satisfying to the eye, so it can pass through all of this and really look at how it adds to the composition rather than subtract from it. Now that we got the side of the barn sort of laid out, I'm going to move to the cliffs in the background. It gets a little bit more tricky here because I have to give the idea of the dense rock at a distance and then use the values underneath, in a sense even the colors underneath, and show the idea that sometimes there's more of a blocky, dense part of the cliff and sometimes a little bit more open, and then still show the idea of the light pass, the light direction on that cliff as well. Perhaps you'll see that I ultimately draw that cliff a little bit more darker and with a little bit more sort of weight to it, so it counterbalances the ambient light that's hitting the front of the barn, in front of the wood there, and showing up the grain. I'm even using a little bit of line texture here to show the outside pinnacles on the cliff and back of it. But ultimately, look at the amount of information I've left out just so you'll be able to read the light that's on that cliff. And you can see again I'm using that shadow pattern and also the shape welding and the contrast between the light and the dark planes to make sure that the idea of that light logic, that light direction, hits those cliffs correctly and doesn't interfere with that big shape of the barn in front of it. I'll be pulling back here so you can see the context of those cliffs in relationship to the barn. You'll be able to see how I'm really using that higher contrast lighting to bring up a more dramatic effect, as opposed to the, like I said, the ambient light on the wood on the side of the barn and the lights and darks of the clouds in the background. As I mentioned in a previous video, it's really important that you learn how to sort of draw the history of your drawing and learn where it's going and where it's been. So even as you're putting down those larger shapes and overlaying different kind of materials at the beginning, you'll know that you'll be putting something over the top of that, or you'll be accenting some part of the drawing later that will bring more attention to it. That's why frequently you see I'll leave large areas sort of undone, knowing I'm going to bring some line and some texture over the top of it that will punch it into the foreground a little bit more. Or leaving the clouds rather light, and now I'm coming over and making them a little bit more scruffy and have a little bit more texture to them and even a little bit more flow. You can see the way I'm using the pencil. It's really moving back and forth from pencil point to pencil side. Again, just to get the idea of the movement and sort of the storminess of the clouds as it moves into the area. Now we're getting to the point of the composition where I'm really going to jump on the front of this barn and give it a little bit more texture, give it a little bit more personality so it will move up farther into the foreground of the composition. And again, I'm not trying to get too many details in it. I'm hinting at doors and hinting at the windows in the back and the wood grain. You can see this frequently. I'll put marks down and kind of use my finger to kind of smudge it a little bit just to knock down the edges a little bit more. I don't want to get too much texture here, and I know that I'm going to be putting a wash of value over the top of this later, but you can see the texture in the diagram to the left and sort of gauge how I'm applying that to the actual front of the barn. I didn't show the video, but I took a darker blue wash and put it over the front of the barn to kind of unify it a little bit more, and now the ground doesn't have as much weight as it should, enough foreground elements to it. So I'm going in and adding some texture with the colored pencil with that and the boards in the fence to move your eye a little bit more vertically in it. That one little section in the center there. I know I have to put more work into the foreground to unify it a little bit more to make it punch forward, but I'm going to work on the fence and the background a little bit more and then revisit the foreground later. This part gets tricky in the fact that I don't just want to outline those fence posts and rails. What I'm doing is, again, I'm sort of hoping to suggest the fact that that ambient light is still sort of throwing a shadowed area over on the railings. And you can see sometimes I just sort of color them in. Sometimes there's a little bit of texture. Sometimes I'm doing a drop shadow on them to make sure that they unify. But ultimately, I'm trying to make sure that even though I really like this part of the composition, I don't want to favor it too much so it doesn't jump out too much and ruin the idea of fixating on one focal point. Okay, so the most delicate area comes last. So now I'm going to try to drag your eye very delicately back into that house and the bare trees in the background. It's getting a really late afternoon light. It's kind of lit up like a Christmas tree. So I don't want to overdo it too much. I want to just keep the silhouettes of the trees a little bit, hint at the foliage, sort of ask the viewer to fill in a lot of the information, but still acknowledge it that it's a large part of the composition. This delicateness almost sort of counterbalances that big, heavy barn and cliffs in the background. As you can see, there's a lot of suggestion going on. There's a little hint of a car, the railings of the fence in the front, back to the trees again, just a little bit of the sort of disconnected edge that I'm putting in. So even now as I'm hinting at some of these elements back here, one thing you might notice is the last thing I do is I want to anchor that form to the ground and also anchor it to the composition. So the last thing I put down is a little light drop shadow coming off that railing to make sure that you see where it separates from the fields in the foreground. At this point, we're coming to the end of the drawing, and what I usually do is I get the eye to move around the composition, and same thing with a pencil or inks or markers or however I put that stuff in. I want to make sure that those pencil marks move your eye around in a rhythmic way through the composition, but also make sure those value blocks hold together the solidity of the composition so it harmonizes the bigger picture and gives it a good visual weight throughout the entire composition. Now the drawing's finished, and I want to bring up the reference along with it so you can see how many changes I've made and how many differences between the photographic and the drawing is made. And also I'm going to bring in a little bit more a plein air painting that I did on the site so you can see the difference in the color in relationship to the values that I have here. Perhaps you can even see a lot of techniques I used in the painting that I also used in the drawing to hold the composition together and accent certain areas. So I'm going to bring the drawing back up so you can all take a look at it and see the textural choices that I made, the compositional choices, and the simplification and complexity that I put into some areas and changed things around just to make it work as a better composition. So in closing, I'm going to bring up some plein air drawings that I've done over the years, and you can see the difference between the different materials. Sometimes they're line, a lot of times they're value, rainy conditions, dry conditions, deep perspective, sometimes very shallow perspective. But the main rule is that if you want to get this right, you got to practice it, and you got to be able to make a lot of mistakes and see how you put stuff together and do a lot of problem solving. And I hope you liked the video and learned something from it, and feel free to please like it and leave comments and even share it with other people. And thanks for coming, and adios folks, and I'll see you later. Look for the new videos in the future. Thanks a lot. Bye.